Hello everyone, this video tells the story with her husband found a secret door in their house, and when he opened it, she almost there up. There was a lot of red stuff. It's a really crazy and interesting story. Your opinion in the comments. Enjoy your viewing.
My husband found a hidden door in our new house, and when he opened it, I almost vomited. There was so much. Hey everyone, my fiancé John and I recently moved to a new city, hoping to start fresh and leave behind some of the issues we faced back in our old town. We were both excited and nervous, especially about meeting our new neighbors. But things haven't exactly gone as smoothly as we'd hoped. Our new home is an old Victorian-style house, charming but in need of some TLC. We fell in love with it the moment we saw it, imagining all the potential it had. However, it seems our neighbors didn't share our enthusiasm. From the day we moved in, we could sense the cold shoulders and see the disapproving looks. It was clear that our new home, with its peeling paint and overgrown garden, wasn't winning us any popularity contests. We tried to reach out and make a good impression. John baked cookies, and I made an effort to introduce myself to everyone we saw. But no matter what we did, we couldn't seem to break through the icy exterior of our new neighborhood. Our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, even went so far as to tell us outright that our house was an eyesore and brought down the value of the entire block. It was a tough week, filled with awkward encounters and strained smiles. But we kept pushing forward, hoping that with time things would improve. John focused on fixing up the exterior of the house, while I tackled the inside, determined to make it our dream home. We did have one bright spot in all of this, our neighbor across the street, Mr. Thompson. He was a kind old man, always sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee. He waved at us every morning, and one day he came over with a potted plant as a housewarming gift. "You folks new to the neighborhood?" he asked with a warm smile. "Yes, we are," I replied, grateful for his kindness. "We just moved in last week. Well, welcome. This place has needed some new energy for a long time," he said, looking around our yard. "If you need any help, don't hesitate to ask." We thanked him, and he went back to his porch, leaving us feeling a bit more hopeful about our situation. Despite the general unfriendliness, knowing we had at least one ally in the neighborhood made a big difference. John and I have been through a lot together. We met in college, both majoring in architecture, and bonded over our shared love of old buildings. Our relationship grew from late-night study sessions and long walks discussing our dreams of restoring historic homes. After graduation, we decided to start our own business, focusing on renovating old properties. It wasn't easy, especially during the economic downturn, but we managed to scrape by. Our decision to move was driven by a particularly rough patch. Back in our old town, our business had hit a wall. We had a few bad clients who refused to pay, leading to financial strain. On top of that, our previous landlord decided to sell the building where we rented our office space, leaving us scrambling to find a new place. It felt like everything was falling apart, and we desperately needed a change. One evening, about a week after moving in, John and I decided to tackle the basement. It was a dark, musty space, filled with cobwebs and old furniture left by the previous owners. We wanted to clean it out and possibly turn it into a game room or a cozy den. As we moved boxes and old chairs, I noticed something strange. Behind a large, heavy wardrobe pushed against the far wall, I saw the outline of a door. It was small and almost unnoticeable, blending into the shadows of the basement. "John, come look at this!" I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the damp air. John came over, wiping sweat from his brow. "What is it?" I pointed to the hidden door. "Have you ever seen that before?" John shook his head, frowning. "No, I don't think so. The realtor didn't mention anything about another room down here." Curiosity piqued. We moved the wardrobe aside, revealing the door more clearly. It was old and wooden, with a rusted handle that looked like it hadn't been turned in decades. "Should we open it?" I asked, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. John hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, let's see what's inside." He twisted the handle, and with a loud creak, the door swung open. A gust of cold, stale air hit us, carrying with it a smell that made my stomach churn. It was a mix of dampness and something else, something rotten. We stepped inside, using the flashlight on John's phone to light our way. The room was small, more of a large closet than an actual room, but what we saw inside made my blood run cold. Against the walls were shelves lined with jars, each containing what looked like pieces of flesh, floating in a yellowish liquid. Old, blood-stained tools hung from hooks, and in the corner a crude wooden table stood, its surface marred with deep gouges and dark stains. But the worst part was the bodies. 12 of them, all in various states of decay, lay strewn across the floor. Some were more skeletal than others, their skin pulled tight over their bones. Others looked fresher, their faces twisted in expressions of terror. I felt bile rise in my throat, and a scream bubbled up from deep inside me. I turned to John, my eyes wide with horror. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, my voice shaking. John looked just as horrified as I felt. He grabbed my hand and we backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind us. "Call the police," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Now!" My hands trembled as I dialed 911, trying to explain what we had found. It felt like hours before the police arrived, though it was probably only minutes. They swarmed the house, questioning us and cordoning off the basement. As we sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets and trying to process what had just happened, one of the officers came over to us. "We're going to need you to come down to the station to give a full statement," he said, his face grim. John nodded. "Of course, whatever you need." The officer nodded and walked away, leaving us to our thoughts. I turned to John, my voice barely a whisper. Who could have done something like that? John shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "I don't know, but I promise you we'll get to the bottom of this." And so what was supposed to be our fresh start had turned into a nightmare. Our home, our sanctuary, had hidden a dark secret that now threatened to engulf us. As we prepared to head to the police station, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives would never be the same again. The next morning we were visited by Detective Harris, a stern-looking man in his 50s with a salt and pepper mustache. He had an air of authority about him that made me feel both relieved and intimidated. "Mr. and Mrs. Daniels, I need to ask you a few more questions," he said, pulling out a small notebook. "Do you have any idea who might have used that room?" We shook our heads. "No, we just moved in a week ago," John said. "We didn't even know that room existed until yesterday." Detective Harris scribbled something in his notebook. "Do you know anything about the previous owners?" I thought back to what our realtor had told us. Just that the house had been on the market for a while. The previous owners moved out about 6 months ago, but I don't know why. Harris nodded. "We'll be looking into that. In the meantime, I suggest you both stay somewhere else for a while. This is an active crime scene now." The gravity of his words hit me hard. This wasn't just a bad dream, it was real, and it was happening to us. "Do you think the neighbors might know something?" John asked. Harris considered this for a moment. "It's possible. People talk. I'll have my team canvass the area, see if anyone noticed anything unusual." Curiosity piqued. We moved the wardrobe aside, revealing the door more clearly. It was old and wooden, with a rusted handle that looked like it hadn't been turned in decades. "Should we open it?" I asked, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. John hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, let's see what's inside." He twisted the handle, and with a loud creak, the door swung open. A gust of cold, stale air hit us, carrying with it a smell that made my stomach churn. It was a mix of dampness and something else, something rotten. We stepped inside, using the flashlight on John's phone to light our way. The room was small, more of a large closet than an actual room, but what we saw inside made my blood run cold. Against the walls were shelves lined with jars, each containing what looked like pieces of flesh, floating in a yellowish liquid. Old, blood-stained tools hung from hooks, and in the corner, a crude wooden table stood, its surface marred with deep gouges and dark stains. But the worst part was the bodies. 12 of them, all in various states of decay, lay strewn across the floor. Some were more skeletal than others, their skin pulled tight over their bones. Others looked fresher, their faces twisted in expressions of terror. I felt bile rise in my throat, and a scream bubbled up from deep inside me. I turned to John, my eyes wide with horror. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, my voice shaking. John looked just as horrified as I felt. He grabbed my hand and we backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind us. "Call the police," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Now!" My hands trembled as I dialed 911, trying to explain what we had found. It felt like hours before the police arrived, though it was probably only minutes. They swarmed the house, questioning us and cordoning off the basement. As we sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets and trying to process what had just happened, one of the officers came over to us. "We're going to need you to come down to the station to give a full statement," he said, his face grim. John nodded. "Of course. Whatever you need." The officer nodded and walked away, leaving us to our thoughts. I turned to John, my voice barely a whisper. Who could have done something like that? John shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "I don't know, but I promise you, we'll get to the bottom of this." And so, what was supposed to be our fresh start had turned into a nightmare. Our home, our sanctuary, had hidden a dark secret that now threatened to engulf us. As we prepared to head to the police station, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives would never be the same again. The next morning, we were visited by Detective Harris, a stern-looking man in his 50s with a salt-and-pepper mustache. He had an air of authority about him that made me feel both relieved and intimidated. "Mr. and Mrs. Daniels, I need to ask you a few more questions," he said, pulling out a small notebook. "Do you have any idea who might have used that room?" We shook our heads. "No, we just moved in a week ago," John said. "We didn't even know that room existed until yesterday." Detective Harris scribbled something in his notebook. "Do you know anything about the previous owners?" I thought back to what our realtor had told us, just that the house had been on the market for a while. The previous owners moved out about 6 months ago, but I don't know why. Harris nodded. "Well, be looking into that. In the meantime, I suggest you both stay somewhere else for a while. This is an active crime scene now." The gravity of his words hit me hard. This wasn't just a bad dream, it was real, and it was happening to us. "Do you think the neighbors might know something?" John asked. Harris considered this for a moment. "It's possible. People talk. I'll have my team canvass the area, see if anyone noticed anything unusual. It's been a while since my last post, and so much has happened." After the horrifying discovery in our basement, John and I have been trying to piece our lives back together. But it hasn't been easy. The images of the bodies in the basement haunted me day and night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, twisted in terror and pain. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, and I felt like I was losing my mind. John suggested I see a psychologist, and though I was reluctant at first, I knew I needed help. Dr. Rebecca Morgan was recommended to us by a friend of Emily's. From the moment I stepped into her office, I felt a sense of calm. The room was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. Dr. Morgan herself had a gentle demeanor, with kind eyes that made me feel safe. "Tell me what's been happening," she said, her voice soothing. I took a deep breath and began to recount the events of the past few weeks. As I spoke, the floodgates opened, and I found myself crying, unable to stop the torrent of emotions that had been building up inside me. Dr. Morgan listened patiently, offering tissues and comforting words. "It's completely normal to feel this way after experiencing something so traumatic," she said. "But we're going to work through this together." Our sessions became a lifeline for me. Each visit I felt a little stronger, a little more capable of facing the day. Dr. Morgan taught me coping mechanisms to deal with the flashbacks and anxiety. Slowly, I started to see a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, John had been trying to find a job. With everything that had happened, he decided to look for something he could do from home. After a few weeks of searching, he finally found a position as a project manager for a tech company. The job paid well and allowed him to work remotely, which was a huge relief for both of us. Just as things seemed to be settling down, we received a letter that turned our world upside down once again. It arrived on a Friday afternoon, slipped through the mail slot in our front door. The envelope was plain, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message typed out in bold letters, "Next time, the bodies in the basement will be yours." I felt my blood run cold as I read the words. My hands shook and I dropped the letter, backing away as if it were a snake ready to strike. John picked it up, his face going pale as he read it. "We need to call the police," he said, his voice trembling. We dialed 911, explaining the situation as best we could. Within minutes, officers were at our door. Detective Harris was among them, his expression grim as he read the letter. "Do you have any idea who might have sent this?" he asked. John and I shook our heads. "No, none," I replied. We don't have any enemies here. We don't even know anyone that well. Harris nodded, his eyes scanning the room. We'll take this to the lab, see if we can get any prints or trace evidence. In the meantime, I suggest you both stay somewhere else until we can ensure your safety. We packed our bags once again and headed to Emily's house. She was more than happy to have us, though I could see the worry in her eyes. You guys are going to be okay, she said, hugging me tightly. The police will figure this out. As we settled into Emily's guest room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. Who would want to threaten us, and why? The questions swirled in my mind, keeping me up at night. A few days later, Detective Harris called. We've analyzed the letter, he said. There were no fingerprints, but we did find some fibers that we're looking into. We also have a handwriting expert examining the note. Although it's typed, there might be something to go on. We're doing everything we can. Thank you, John said, his voice filled with gratitude. Please, keep us updated. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Emily did her best to keep our spirits up, cooking meals and suggesting we watch movies to distract ourselves. But it was hard to focus on anything other than the looming threat. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Emily's husband, Mark, brought up an idea. Have you thought about installing security cameras? He asked. It might give you some peace of mind. John nodded. That's a good idea. I'll look into it. We spent the next day setting up cameras around our house, hoping that it would deter whoever was targeting us. John also installed a high-tech alarm system, one that would alert us and the police at the first sign of trouble. That night, for the first time in days, I felt a small sense of security. We returned to our house, determined to reclaim our lives. But as fate would have it, our troubles were far from over. 2 days later, we received another letter. This time, it was hand-delivered, left on our doorstep in broad daylight. The message was even more chilling than the first. You can run, but you can't hide. We're watching. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. Who were these people? Why were they doing this? I turned to John, my voice shaking. We need to get out of here. He nodded, his face set with determination. Let's go to the police station. We can't stay here. We grabbed our things and headed to the station, where Detective Harris was waiting for us. He took the new letter and read it carefully, his brow furrowing. This is serious, he said. We're going to take this to the lab as well. In the meantime, I want you both to stay somewhere safe. We'll increase patrols around your house. As we left the station, I felt a mix of fear and frustration. We were doing everything we could, but it didn't seem to be enough. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming. Back at Emily's, we tried to come up with a plan. Maybe we should just leave, I suggested. Start over somewhere else. John shook his head. I don't want to run. This is our home. We can't let them drive us away. Emily agreed. Besides, if you leave, you might still be in danger. At least here, the police are involved and can protect you. Reluctantly, I agreed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. The following day, Detective Harris called with an update. We've found some leads, he said. The fibers on the first letter matched a type of fabric used in a local factory. We're looking into it. Do you think it could be someone who works there? I asked. It's possible, he replied. We're also reviewing security footage from your neighborhood. We might be able to identify who delivered the second letter. It was a small glimmer of hope, but it was enough to keep us going. Over the next few days, we stayed vigilant, keeping an eye on the security cameras and trying to go about our lives as normally as possible. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, John's phone buzzed. It was a notification from the security system. Someone had triggered the motion sensor in our backyard. He pulled up the live feed, and we saw a figure moving in the darkness. Call the police, I whispered, my heart pounding. John dialed 911, explaining the situation. Within minutes, patrol cars were on their way. We watched the screen, holding our breath as the figure moved closer to the house. Just as the police arrived, the person turned and ran, disappearing into the night. The officers searched the area but found no trace of the intruder. Detective Harris arrived shortly after, his expression serious. This is escalating, he said. We need to get you both into protective custody. We agreed, not wanting to take any more chances. The police arranged for us to stay in a safe house away from prying eyes. It was a small, nondescript apartment in a quiet part of town. There, we hoped we would finally be safe. As we settled into our new temporary home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. We were cut off from our friends, our family, and our home. The only contact we had with the outside world was through the police. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard a noise outside. It was faint, but enough to make me sit up, my heart racing. I crept to the window and peeked out, but saw nothing. Still, the sense of unease lingered. The next morning, Detective Harris called with an update. "We've identified the person who delivered the second letter," he said. "It's someone who works at the factory where the fibers came from. Do you have a name?" John asked. "Yes, it's Michael Thompson. We're bringing him in for questioning." The name sent a shiver down my spine. "That's our neighbor's last name," I said. "The one who was nice to us." Harris paused. "I'll look into that. In the meantime, stay where you are. We'll keep you updated." The wait was agonizing. Every moment felt like an eternity as we waited for news. Finally, Harris called again. "We've questioned Michael Thompson. He denies everything, but we found evidence linking him to the letters. We're holding him for further investigation." It was a relief to know that they had someone in custody, but the fear still lingered. What if he wasn't the only one involved? What if there were others? As we pondered these questions, the doorbell rang. John and I exchanged a nervous glance before he went to answer it. Standing on the other side was Mr. Thompson, our neighbor. "I heard what happened," he said, his face a mask of concern. "I wanted to check on you both." John hesitated, then invited him in. We sat in the small living room, the tension palpable. "I can't believe Michael would do something like this," Mr. Thompson said, shaking his head. "He's always been such a good kid." "Do you think he could be involved with someone else?" I asked. Mr. Thompson sighed. "I don't know. But if there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." We thanked him, appreciating the gesture. But as he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Days turned into weeks, and we tried to rebuild our lives as best we could. The police kept us informed, but there were no major breakthroughs. Michael Thompson maintained his innocence, and the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. One afternoon, as John and I were walking in the park near the safe house, we ran into Mr. Thompson again. He seemed agitated, glancing around nervously. "Is everything okay?" John asked. Mr. Thompson shook his head. "I've been hearing things," he said quietly. "Rumors about a group in town. They're into some dark stuff." "What kind of group?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. He lowered his voice. "A cult. They've been around for years, but no one talks about them. If Michael is involved with them, it could explain a lot." The revelation sent a chill down my spine. A cult? It seemed too bizarre to be true, but given everything that had happened, I couldn't dismiss it. "Do you know where we could find more information about this group?" John asked. Mr. Thompson nodded. "There's a woman named Clara who lives on the outskirts of town. She used to be involved with them, but got out years ago. She might be able to help." We thanked him and decided to pay Clara a visit. The drive to her house was tense, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we arrived, we found a small, weathered cottage surrounded by trees. Clara answered the door, a wary look in her eyes. "Can I help you?" "We were told you might have information about a group in town," John said. "A cult." Clara's expression hardened. "Who sent you?" "Mr. Thompson, our neighbor," I replied. "His nephew Michael is in trouble, and we think it might be connected to the cult." She studied us for a moment, then stepped aside, motioning for us to enter. "Come in, but keep your voices down. They have ears everywhere." Inside, the cottage was cozy but cluttered, filled with books and trinkets. Clara led us to a small sitting room and offered us tea. "You're brave to come here," she said, her voice low. "Not many dare to speak about the group. They call themselves the Keepers. They believe in cleansing the world of impurities." My heart pounded as I listened. "And you were part of this?" Clara nodded. "Years ago, I was young and naive. They prey on the vulnerable, offering a sense of belonging and purpose. But their methods are dark, twisted." "Do you think Michael could be involved with them?" John asked. "It's possible," she replied. "They're always looking for new members, especially those who can be easily manipulated." We spent hours talking with Clara, learning about the cult's history and practices. She gave us names and locations, people who might know more. As we left, she warned us to be careful. "They won't hesitate to silence anyone who gets too close," she said, her eyes filled with fear. Back at the safe house, we shared everything we had learned with Detective Harris. He was skeptical but promised to look into it. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. The police investigated the cult, following leads and questioning suspects. Meanwhile, John and I tried to stay out of sight, fearing for our safety. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, there was a knock on the door. It was Detective Harris, looking grim. "We've found evidence linking the keepers to the threats against you," he said. "It's not enough to make any arrests yet, but it's a start. I need you both to be extra cautious." We nodded, grateful for the warning, but the sense of dread only grew. We were dealing with something far more dangerous than we had imagined. The days that followed were filled with tension and fear. We stayed inside as much as possible, avoiding anyone who might be watching us. The police continued their investigation, but progress was slow. One evening, as John and I were sitting on the couch, trying to distract ourselves with a movie, there was a loud crash from the kitchen. We jumped up, hearts racing. "Stay here," John said, grabbing a baseball bat from the corner of the room. He moved cautiously toward the kitchen, and I followed a few steps behind, unable to stay put. In the kitchen, we found a broken window and a rock lying on the floor. Attached to it was a note scrawled in jagged letters, "We warned you. Leave town or suffer the consequences." My hands trembled as I picked up the note. "What are we going to do, John?" He looked at me, his expression fierce. "We're not running. We're going to fight back." We called Detective Harris, who arrived within minutes. He examined the note and the broken window, his face a mask of concern. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "We're going to put you under 24-hour surveillance. Station officers outside your house." It was a relief to know we would have constant protection, but the fear still lingered. We were up against something far bigger and more sinister than we had ever imagined. The next day, Detective Harris called with an update. "We've arrested a few members of the Keepers," he said. "They're not talking yet, but it's a start. We're also keeping an eye on Michael Thompson. He's been acting suspiciously." As the days turned into weeks, the police continued their investigation. Slowly, they began to dismantle the Keepers, arresting key members and gathering evidence. The threats against us stopped, but the fear never entirely went away. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, John took my hand. "We've been through hell, but we're still here," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We're not going to let them win." I nodded, feeling a sense of resolve. We had survived the worst, and we were stronger for it. Our lives would never be the same, but we had each other, and that was enough. As we moved forward, we remained vigilant, always aware of the shadows that lurked just out of sight. But with the support of the police and our friends, we began to rebuild our lives, determined to find peace and happiness once more. And though the memories of that dark basement would never fully fade, we learned to live with them, finding strength in each other and in the love that had carried us through the darkest of times. It's been a long journey, but I wanted to share the latest and most significant update in our story. After months of fear, anxiety, and relentless pursuit, we finally found the person responsible for the horrors in our basement. Here's how it all went down. As you know, we had been living in fear after discovering the bodies in our basement and receiving the threatening letters. The police had been investigating the Keepers. The cult we suspected was behind everything and had made several arrests. But the leader, the mastermind, was still out there. One evening as we sat in the safe house, there was a knock on the door. It was Detective Harris, looking more determined than ever. "We've got a lead," he said, his voice urgent. "We think we know where the leader is hiding." John and I exchanged a glance, a mix of hope and fear in our eyes. "Where?" John asked. "There's an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town," Harris explained. "It's been linked to several of the cult's activities. We believe the leader might be using it as a base." We agreed to accompany Harris and his team, feeling a mix of trepidation and determination. This was our chance to finally put an end to the nightmare that had consumed our lives. The drive to the warehouse was tense, the silence in the car thick with anticipation. When we arrived, the police had already surrounded the building, their guns drawn and ready. Harris turned to us, his expression serious. "Stay back and stay safe. We'll handle this." We watched from a safe distance as the officers moved in, their movements swift and coordinated. The front door of the warehouse was kicked open, and the police stormed inside. Shouts and gunfire echoed from within, sending chills down my spine. Minutes felt like hours as we waited for news. Finally, Harris emerged, a grim but triumphant look on his face. "We got him," he said simply. The leader of the keepers, a man named Richard Marks, was dragged out in handcuffs. His face was twisted in anger, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. He was taken away, and we were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. Back at the police station, Harris sat us down. "We found evidence linking Marks to the murders in your basement," he said. "He was the one sending the letters, trying to scare you into leaving so he could continue his activities undisturbed." The weight of his words sank in, and I felt a surge of relief. The nightmare was over. Richard Marks was behind bars, and we could finally start to rebuild our lives. The trial was a lengthy process, filled with testimonies, evidence, and countless legal procedures. But in the end, justice was served. Marks was found guilty on all charges, including multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As we sat in the courtroom, hearing the judge's final verdict, I felt a sense of closure. The man who had terrorized us and taken so many innocent lives was finally going to pay for his crimes. After the trial, John and I decided to take a much-needed vacation. We went to a small, peaceful cabin in the mountains, far away from the chaos that had consumed our lives. It was there, surrounded by nature, that we began to heal. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, John turned to me. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "We got through it." I nodded, tears of relief and joy streaming down my face. We did, and now we can finally move on. Returning home was bittersweet. The house that had once been a place of horror was now a symbol of our strength and resilience. With the support of our friends, family, and the community, we began to renovate it, turning it into the home we had always dreamed of. The neighbors who had once been cold and distant began to warm up to us. Mr. Thompson, our kind neighbor across the street, became a close friend, always ready with a helping hand and a friendly smile. Even Mrs. Peterson softened, bringing us a homemade pie as a peace offering. As the weeks turned into months, life began to settle into a new normal. The memories of the past still lingered, but they no longer had the power to haunt us. We had faced our fears, stood up to the darkness, and emerged stronger on the other side. One sunny afternoon, as we worked in the garden, planting flowers and vegetables, John looked at me and smiled. "I'm proud of us," he said. I smiled back, feeling a deep sense of contentment. Me too. We've come a long way. And so, as we continued to build our new life together, we knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we could face them. We had each other, and that was enough. Our story was one of resilience, love, and the unwavering belief that even in the darkest times, there is always hope. Thank you to everyone who followed our journey and supported us through the toughest times. Your words of encouragement meant the world to us. Life is full of unexpected twists and turns, but with love and determination, we can overcome anything. Here's to new beginnings and a future filled with happiness. If you've read this far, thank you for being part of our story. Your support has been incredible, and we're grateful for each and every one of you. Stay strong, and remember, no matter how dark it gets, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. With love, Jane and John.
Hello guys, it's really crazy and it's a story. What do you think? Write comment, put like, subscribe to this channel, Instagram and Discord. Good luck!